Good morning, church. Man, great to see everybody here this morning. For those of you who are visiting with us today, or for those of you who maybe wasn't here last week, we are in a new series entitled One. And what we're doing in this series is we are looking for that one person that God has placed in our path for you and I to lead to Christ. In fact, what I asked you guys to do last week was to take this piece of paper that we passed out and to write down the name of someone who lives local, right here in Winter Haven. Some of you may live in Haines City or maybe some other places, but locally where you live, I want you to write down the name of someone on this piece of paper and commit to praying for them every single day that they will come to Christ. And one of the things I told you is I'm going to have our elders pray over these names as well. I'm going to be praying over these names as well. And let me tell you something. When we lift people up before God, things begin to happen. God begins to work. And so make sure that you do that. Now, not only am I asking you to commit to pray for that person that you write on that piece of paper, I'm also asking you to have some involvement with that individual. Maybe you go out to dinner with them. Maybe you go to one of their kids' ball games. But I'm talking about outside of work, outside the neighborhood. Maybe you invite that person into your home. But I want to encourage you to interact with them. And then thirdly, I want to ask you to do one other thing. I want you to commit to asking them to come with you to church. Okay? Now, if you have not had a chance to do this, out in the very back on this table, all the way out into the foyer, you'll find some of these slips of paper. There's also some at the welcome station as well. But if you will, commit to one person, okay? Leading one person to Jesus, or drawing one person closer to Jesus, and you can hand me that slip of paper when you're done. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, Slate, I really don't know one person that would really come with me to church, that would even be interested in Christ. I mean, I think about the people that I work with, and I think about some of the people who live in my neighborhood, and I'm not real sure that I can come up with even one name. And really, this is what this whole series is about. Write this down. Jesus can bring anyone into His story. Anyone. So what that means is we don't write anyone off. We don't think in our minds, that person could never come to Jesus. That person would never come to church with me. We don't think that, because anyone, okay, anyone can be brought into the story of Jesus. Even that person who maybe in our eyes seems hopeless. And really that leads us into our story today, our next story about Jesus. And it's going to come from Mark chapter 5. You can be turning over there. I'll give you a little bit of background information. If you back up to Mark chapter 4. Okay, and in Mark chapter 4, what you have is really a revival. Okay, because people, huge crowds, are coming to Jesus. And there's a lot of energy, and there's a lot of excitement. And then all of a sudden Jesus does something very interesting. He turns to His disciples and He said, let's get in the boat and let's go across the lake. Now that's interesting because there's really nothing across the lake. What's across the lake is Gentile country. But the disciples, they listen to Jesus. They do what He says. They get in the boat. And as they're going across this lake, there is this huge storm arises. Now you have to understand that these guys, many of them were fishermen. And so they were used to storms. And so this must have been a really bad storm, because the Bible tells us that they were absolutely terrified. They thought that they were going to drown. Now Jesus is asleep through all of this. And so they go and they wake up Jesus, and you probably remember what Jesus does. He wakes up, and I love how my translation reads. It quotes Jesus as saying to the storm, "Quiet down." Your translation may have Jesus saying, "Peace, be still." And immediately the wind and the waves stopped. And now these disciples who were terrified, now they are even more terrified because of who is in the boat with them, because they start turning to each other and they began to ask, "Who is this? That even the winds and the waves obey Him." You talk about a crazy day. But let me tell you something, it's fixing to get a lot crazier, okay? So now we pick up in chapter 5. Starting in verse 2, and it says, "When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from the tombs to meet Him. This man lived in the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. Whenever he was put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrists and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night he wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones." You talk about a crazy day. These guys, they are experiencing now a storm on the land that is just as bad as the storm that they survived on the sea, because there is this guy who is approaching them who is demon possessed. He is out of his mind and he is absolutely out of control. Also think about this. If you're a Jew, this is the last place you want to be. Because if you are a Jew, you did not want to be near pigs, because they were considered unclean. Leviticus chapter 11 verse 7. And there were pigs, as you're going to read in just a few minutes, there were pigs everywhere. Thousands of pigs. Not only that, if you were a Jew, you didn't want to go near tombs. You didn't want to be near dead people. Numbers chapter 5 verse 2, and here they are, Jesus pulls them up to a cemetery. And besides that, you sure didn't want to be around demons, and there is a guy who is full of demons and he's coming towards you. You talk about a bad situation. I'm sure no one even wanted to get out of the boat except for Jesus. Because there was a man who was out of his mind and he was hurting himself. In fact, if you look back at verse 5, it says that this guy is taking stones and he is cutting himself. Listen to me, cutting is nothing new. It's been around. But here's what I want you to understand. The devil's a murderer. He wants to destroy you. He wants to destroy your relationships. He wants to destroy your emotional health. He wants to destroy your physical health. And here's the deal. This guy had no friends. I mean, as you read through the Gospels, there's all kinds of stories of someone taking a friend who's blind or who's lame or who's demon-possessed, and they lead that individual to Jesus, right? Or maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a mother and a father, and they go to Jesus pleading for their child who is very, very sick or maybe even demon-possessed. But this guy has nobody. In fact, the only human interaction he has is people who are coming to try and put him in chains, who are trying to bind him. But as you look back at this story, chains cannot bind this guy. But let me tell you something, he was bound. He was bound by the enemy. And so why? Why would Jesus want to leave this ministry that's going so well? I mean, there's this huge revival. People are coming to Him. Lots of energy. Lots of people. Why would He leave all of that for this? And here's the answer. It may be the most important thing I say today. I hope you write this down. No one is hopeless to Jesus. Let's say that on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. No one is hopeless to Jesus. No one. And I think we need to hear that because sometimes we interact with people, we get into situations where people frustrate us, and what we can be tempted to do is just simply write that person off or give up on that individual when in fact God is not through with them yet. In fact, this man's bondage was no more difficult to Jesus than your bondage was. And yes, you and I, we were in bondage as well. But here's the deal. Here's what I want us to understand today. Satan has no jurisdiction where Jesus is. In fact, let's keep reading in our text, verses 7 through 10. Notice what it says. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Then Jesus demanded, "What is your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us inside this man." Then the evil spirit begged him again and again not to send them to some distant place. I love this. I love reading stories like this because what we see here is that the demons realizes who is in charge. You never see a demon who says, "Jesus, are you ready for a fight?" Not even once. In fact, they are terrified, they are scared to death because they know that Jesus is fixing to kick them out. And I love that. That's the God we serve. Our God is so big, Nahum the mountains, they quake before Him. The raging storm goes calm. Thank you. Goes calm before Him, and the demons run, and the demons flee. And that everyone else wants to avoid. You want this? Thank you. Kind of reminds me because you began to ask the question, why? Why would Jesus go to this guy? 350 years ago, there was a guy by the name of Antonio Stradivarius who was a craftsman. He made violins. But unlike other people who made instruments during that day and time, he was very poor. And so he couldn't buy the finest wood to make his violins. And so what he ended up doing was he would go down to the harbor and he would take driftwood, the wood that nobody wanted, the wood that was basically considered junk, and he made violins with them. And what they didn't know then, but we do now, is the microbes in the water would actually hollow out resinous chambers in the wood in his violins, so that his violins would make just a beautiful sound. In other words, the trash that no one wanted became the treasure that the whole world loves. In fact, the Stradivarius violins are the most popular and the most valuable violins in the world. In a similar sense, like that wood that no one wanted, You are treasured by God. You are so valuable to our God. He sees who you really are. Even that one who may seem hopeless, even that one who may seem like he or she has no future, God sees your value deep within you. Jesus saw the value in this man. And as he approaches Jesus, the man asks Jesus a very interesting question. He says, "What do you want with me?" And the answer is this: Jesus just wanted to release him. In fact, He wants to release everyone from bondage. You see, Jesus doesn't want to just redeem us. He wants to release us, so that we can become who God created us to be. And not just one day. God doesn't want to just give us life one day after the grave. Jesus wants to give us life now, so that we can be everything that God created us to be. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. He says, "This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a" what, church? A new person. The old life is what? Is gone, and a new life will begin. A new life has begun. Jesus wants to give you a new life now. He wants to free you from bondage now. And so Jesus engages this man who's full of demons. And I want you to look what happens next. Verses 11 through 13. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. "Send us into those pigs," the spirit begged. "Let us enter them." So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits came out of the man, entered the pigs, and the entire herd of about 2,000 pigs plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned into the water. Okay, and so notice what happens. These evil spirits, these demons, are begging Jesus to send them into these pigs. And Jesus gives them permission, and when they go into the pigs, all these pigs, now you have to remember, this was someone's livelihood. All these pigs, all 2,000 of them, go off the hillside and into the water, and they drowned. Now, as you can imagine, this caused a huge commotion, and so notice what happened next. The herdsmen, the owners of the pigs, they fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran. People rushed out to see what had happened. A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there fully clothed. And what, church? And perfectly sane. And that's what Jesus wants. He wants to restore us to the capacity to where we reflect the divine image. Because you see, you and I, we are created in the image of God. You realize that? Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man in His what, church? In His own image. We are created in the image of God, but Satan doesn't want people to see the Creator within you. And so he wants to bind you. He wants to chain you. He wants to enslave you to things like anger and bitterness and hatred and greed and lust, so that people will not see God in you. And here's the deal, we can't escape on our own. Paul talks about this very thing in Romans chapter 7, verse 24. He says, "Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death?" And then he gives the answer. He says, thank God. The answer is in who, church? The answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. You see, no one gets free and comes to Jesus. But anyone can come to Jesus and get free. Because of what He did on the cross, because of His death, burial, and resurrection, listen to me, every prison cell of Satan was thrown open. Every chain was loosed. So that now the question is not the possibility of freedom, but the question is, are we connected to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that has disarmed the enemy? You guys have probably noticed we put a lot of emphasis on baptism here at Central. And when you look at Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through 7, and you begin to understand why. When we were joined with Christ Jesus in what church? In baptism, we were joined in His what? In His death. For we died and were buried with Christ by what? Baptism. And just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glorious power of the Father, now we also may live new lives. For if we have been united with Him in His what? In His death like this, we will certainly be united with Him in a what? In a resurrection like this. Do you guys get that? I mean, I want you to understand. Don't leave without understanding this morning. When you are baptized into Christ, it connects you with the most important event in all of history. You are connected to the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And just like He died on that cross, we die to sin, and we are buried, and we are raised anew, just as Jesus Christ raised up out of that tomb to a new life. What Jesus did through His death, burial, and the resurrection was a game changer for us. When we come to Him, when we put Him on in baptism, everything is new now. Everything is different now. There are possibilities now that never existed before because of Jesus. We can be released to be everything we were created to be. Some of you need to write this down this morning because this is so important. Someone here needs to hear this today. The way things are do not have to be the way things stay. Someone needs to pin that up on their refrigerator, put it on the mirror in their bathroom. Some of you need to look at this every single day. The way things are do not have to be the way things stay. Because there is one in us who is more powerful than anything that can enslave us. Jesus wants to release us from every bondage. He wants to release everyone for worship. And some of you may scratch your head at that and say, well, Slate, what do you mean, release everyone to worship? Well, the worship wars have been going on a really long time. It started in heaven. Lucifer decided that he wanted the worship that was due only to God, and so he was kicked out of heaven. But that didn't change what he wanted. He still wanted to receive worship. He wanted to receive what was only due to God. In fact, as you get into Matthew chapter 4, the temptations of Jesus, you see that Satan comes to Jesus, takes Him up on this mountain, shows Him all the kingdoms of the earth, and He says, if you will just bow down and worship Me, He says, I'll give you all of this. You see, beneath so much of the world's bondage is a deeper problem. And that is, many times people have not lined up their lives and their affection for God. We've let things, or we've let someone become our worship. We've tried to make something or someone that filler for the hole that only God can fill. And it only produces bondage. But Jesus knows when someone wants to be free. We go back to our text, verse 6, and notice what it says. When Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and he did what, church? He bowed low before him. Eddie was looking at this particular text in a class not too long ago, and we were talking about this very verse. And what's interesting, I really like the way the King James Version reads this, because I think it brings the picture of what really took place here. Verse 6 says, "But when he saw Jesus, he ran," and he what, church? He worshiped Him. Here's this guy, he's enslaved, he's in bondage, but there is something deep inside him that wants to be free. And so get this, why did Jesus cross this lake? Well, it wasn't to just rebuke thousands of demons. It was to set this worshiper free. Because God seeks worshipers. We learn that in the story of the Samaritan woman. God seeks worshipers. We're not the seeker. God is. That's what He does. And He releases us from those things that keep us from worshiping Him, that keep us in bondage. James chapter 4, verse 7 says, "Submit yourselves then to who, church? To God." In other words, we need to let God reign in our lives. We need to submit to God. And notice what he continues to write. "Resist the devil and he will what, church? And he will flee from you." Now, why will the devil flee from you? Is it because he's scared of you? Look at the very next verse, verse 8. "Come near to God and He will what? And He will come near to you." When you submit to God, when you make God the Lord over your life, He will come near to you. And let me tell you something, the devil doesn't want anything to do with that. The devil will flee from God, and his demons will flee from God every single time. There's probably someone here this morning who maybe is struggling with bondage. Or maybe this morning you know someone who maybe you consider kind of hopeless. I mean, you look at their life and the things that they do. Maybe it's a coworker again. Maybe it's someone in your neighborhood. Maybe it's a family member. And I mean, their life is just it's a mess. And so you don't expect them to come to church, and if they did, you'd probably be shocked, right? But what if that person was one prayer, one meal, one invite away from a breakthrough? Reggie, where you at, bud? Come on down. I'm going to interview Reggie this morning. I really wanted him to share his story with you. Reggie hasn't been a Christian very long, probably a little over a year, probably getting close to 2 years. But let me ask you this question. Going back to when you were younger, how was life for you?
Very hard. Grew up with 3 sisters. I'm the only boy and the youngest, so I had to grow up fast, but also got in the streets fast. So,
What happened to you when you were 2 years old?
my father committed suicide.
And so, how'd you end up on the street?
Just experiencing drugs at a young age, doing stuff that, shouldn't be doing.
I met Reggie as Julie and I were walking around our neighborhood. Reggie lived in our neighborhood at one time. In the house I'm in now, he was actually renting it. And so as we were walking around, Reggie was coming out of his garage. And Julie and I knew most of our neighbors, but we had never met Reggie. And so Julie and I decided we were going to go up and we were going to introduce ourselves. And so we did. And even then, life was not great for you. I remember that day so vividly. We introduced ourselves, we got to know you, and just in those few moments you broke down crying because you were going through a lot. I'm not going to ask you to go into a lot of that kind of stuff. But do you remember what we did with you that day?
Yeah, we prayed. You asked me to pray, if you could pray for me. And it just took off from there.
And so we prayed together, and I remember you cried, and we invited you to church, and didn't know that you would be here today, that all of that would come full circle. But basically what happened was we just kept, as we were walking in the neighborhood, we would talk to Reggie. We prayed through some tough times together, and then Reggie shows up at church. And then before too long ended up baptizing him into Christ, and he became a Christian. And Reggie is a new Christian. And things, and I wanted to bring this out, and I asked him if it was okay for me to do this, but even as a new Christian, Satan wanted you back. In fact, Reggie got into drugs. He took a drug that you can become addicted to the very first time that you take it, and it's a very powerful drug. But God has freed him from that. He's drug-free. He's back in church. If you don't see Reggie sitting by me on Sunday morning, he's now a part of our tech team. And so he is involved in our sound and everything, but he has a great job, and he's just doing really good. And we love you, and we're so proud of you.
I love you guys too. And it's all because of God.
I want to share his story with you because just like Reggie, you encounter people. And Reggie, man, if you would have talked to him that day that we talked, things were just a wreck. His life was a mess. But this is what I know. A changed man can become, or a chained man can become a charged man, and a charged man can become a changed man can become a charged man. And Reggie, I want you to hear the last part of this story because you are a new Christian. And for those of you who are new Christians here today, or even have been Christians for a long time, the last part of this story is very interesting because you look at verse 19 and it says, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus said, no, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful He has been. And so Jesus cast out the demons from this guy, and this guy is just so excited, and he wants to go with Jesus, but Jesus says, no. And the reason why is because Jesus releases people from prison so that He can release them for mission. Reggie is a new Christian, and we have some others who are new Christians in here. Some of you have been Christians for a long time. And what I would say to all of us who are children of God, whether we've just put on Christ in baptism, or whether we've been Christians for years, we've got a story, guys, and we've got to go out and we've got to tell the world what Jesus has done for us. You may not have a degree in Bible theology, but let me tell you what you do have. You have a testimony, just like Reggie has a testimony. And people need your story. They need to hear you say, man, Jesus changed me. I used to run to this pill, or I used to run to this powder, or I used to run to this bottle, or I used to run to this lust. But it never lasted, and so now I run to Jesus, and He has changed my life. Someone needs your story. Someone needs to know that no one is hopeless without Jesus. And that person may be you. You may need to look at your neighbors, and you may need to look at your coworkers and those that you go to school with differently. No one is hopeless to Jesus. He can set anyone free. We're going to offer an invitation. And there may be someone here today who needs to be free. You've been enslaved to sin too long. And it's time for you to come to Jesus and know what it's like to be free. Because through Christ, anything and everything that you have ever done can be forgiven. And it's through Christ that we are empowered to overcome sin. We are no longer a slave to sin in Jesus Christ. Or it may be that there's someone like Reggie who is a Christian, but Satan wanted you back, and maybe you've fallen down for a time period, and you're ready to come back to Jesus and be free again, because Jesus is the only one who can set you free. Whatever the case may be, one of our elders will come up. We would love to pray for you. We'd love to minister to you in whatever way that we can. But today, I want to encourage you as you go out these doors to, number one, make sure your life is right with Jesus. And number two, you take Jesus as you go out these doors to other people. And so if you need to respond, once you come, together we stand and sing.